In Davey Wreden's The Stanley Parable, the player plays as Stanley, an office worker at Cubicle 427, whose job is to push buttons all day. When the game starts, the company's employees all suddenly disappear, and the narrator uses his narration to guide Stanley around the office to find out what happened. However, the player has the choice to defy the narrator, and various endings result from the player's decisions. In this essay, I argue that the Stanley Parable, through the illusory mechanic of choice, adopts a Marxist lens to demonstrate that agency within a controlling and exploitative system can only be fully achieved through overthrowing said system. To clarify, the scope of this analysis only covers the original version of the Stanley Parable. I have no knowledge of what happens in the deluxe version. The player initially feels that the Stanley Parable is a game that grants players agency to affect the game, but in actuality, the player has no agency. After the beginning cutscene, you can walk around the office until you reach a room with 2 doors. The narrator says Stanley chose the door on the left. Here, it becomes clear to the player that you can choose to either follow the narrator's lead or defy him. When you're playing through this defiant route, you initially feel a sense of rebellion and freedom of agency against the game's predetermined story. After all, you're literally defying the narrator's instructions. However, as you continue defying the narrator, it becomes clear that even your agency in defiance is controlled by the game. The door on the right is intentionally built into the game. The narrator's script already is written to account for your disobedience. The rooms that you're not supposed to enter have open doors. Doors only open when the narrator wants you to go through them. Thus, the player actually has no agency in the game because all of their choices within the game are predetermined. Marxist ideas of the separation of the citizen's identity into a private and communal self are integral to interpreting the game's story. In his essay on the Jewish question, Marx uses the example of Jews in Germany to highlight a broader problem of differentiations in a citizen's private life, separating him from his greater community. Marx states he lives in the political community, where he regards himself as a communal being, and in civil society, where he acts simply as a private individual, treats other men as means, degrades himself to the role of a mere means, and becomes a plaything of alien powers. Man, in his most intimate reality, in civil society, is a profane being. Here, when he appears both to himself and to others as a real individual, he is an illusory phenomenon. In the state, on the contrary, where he is regarded as a species being, man is the imaginary member of an imaginary sovereignty, divested of his real individual life and infused with an unreal universality. In civil society, man lives as a private being. The private being consists of private attributes such as religion, occupation, gender, and plenty more, which each serve as differentiations from their community and species being, aka their communal self. This leads to man identifying with their private selves before their species being. For example, identifying oneself as a Jew rather than as a German first. This prioritization of private self over species being prevents unity within a community and allows men to see each other only as a means to their private ends, rather than fellow members of a community. This separation then promotes the commodification of man as a laborer, a means to the end of profit, as Marx describes the proletariat in the Communist Festo as a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity. Differentiations allow the man to prioritize his private self over his communal species being, which includes his occupation, increasing competition and division among men. With a capitalist system of production that only values the most competitive workers, and with the private man prevailing over the communal species being, man fights to be the most appealing commodity. Thus, through the process of differentiation, man makes himself into a commodity for those who own the means of production to exploit. 2 endings, the apartment and heaven ending, represent Marx's ideas of separation and differentiation. In one section of the apartment ending, which you can encounter through continually disobeying the narrator until reaching Stanley's apartment, the game tells you to press buttons to go through every part of Stanley's monotonous days as his apartment, which has the same number as his office cubicle, slowly transforms into his office. At one point, the narrator tells you not to press the buttons, but you have no choice but to press them if you want to progress, highlighting the game's control over you as a player and work's control over Stanley. In the heaven ending, Stanley is surrounded by buttons that he can press to his heart's content. These endings depict Stanley as always a worker first. Work is literally his heaven, and his home life centers around work. As Stanley prioritizes his private identity as a worker, rather than his species being, any possibility for a genuine family or other relation disappears. As long as the private aspect of work forever dominates Stanley's psyche, he will always be separated from other human beings and his own species being, or his communal identity. He cannot escape separation when he continues to identify with his individual self as a worker over his species being. Marx further corroborates this in another quote from the Communist Manifesto, where he argues that the bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. Having a family or other communal relation is impossible for Stanley when all that matters is work, when other men have become commodified and only a means to his ends as a private individual. Stanley is a commodity within the capitalist machine, his agency trapped in the whims of those controlling the means of production. Thus, Stanley, having becoming dominated by the capitalist system as shown within the game, has no agency. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write, "The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society, except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. It is impossible to gain agency from an exploitative and controlling system from within. Agency is gained only through abolishing this system and establishing a new system that grants agency to all." In the context of the Stanley Parable's apartment ending, the answer lies in rejecting the buttons entirely, rejecting the game that controls you. Defiance that navigates within the confines of the game is ultimately still playing by the game's rules. Stanley's mindless button pressing during his job mirrors the player, and his imprisonment in capitalist production will only end through rejection of its structure. The only moments in the game where the player can feel a true sense of agency is when they reach either the freedom or museum endings. In the freedom ending, the player enters the mind control facility and shuts off the power, which opens a door to the outside world where Stanley can finally escape to a new life in the outside world. In the museum ending, right as Stanley is about to be crushed to death, a new female narrator steps in and transports the player to a museum, exhibiting different snapshots of the Stanley Parable's development process. At the end of the museum, the player can press the off switch, where they are transported back to Stanley's impending doom, with the female narrator's pleas for the player to turn off the game, as it is the only way to truly achieve freedom from the game's endless cycle. These endings are a manifestation of Marx's idea of abolishing systems that strip agency. The freedom ending demonstrates rebellion and agency for the characters within the game. Stanley actively makes the decision to completely destroy the system and setting in which the office resides. The freedom ending may not spell freedom for you as the player, but it grants freedom to Stanley as a character. He has overthrown the mind-controlling system that his company had subjected him to, which now grants him agency over his life. The museum ending, on the other hand, shows you as the player how to take your agency back from the game. The game's transparency and meta-references to itself as a game through the museum exhibits emphasize the game as a system that the player is playing under. Furthermore, the female narrator outright explains to the player that freedom and agency can only come through exiting the game, which is a form of defying and abolishing the game and its systems entirely. Of course, considering Marx existed in a time period much before video games, his ideas come with limitations when applied to such technology. It could be argued that the form of the Stanley Parable as a game entraps the player into the system of the game. Even if you get the endings that grant you or Stanley freedom, many players have gotten this ending purely in order to reach all endings of the game, and not with the intention to actually achieve agency. In this way, players are still abiding by the systems of the game, even when they achieve agency on the screen. The player's acquisition of agency is only a side effect of their pursuit of endlessly pressing buttons. Furthermore, the impact and agency of each decision is lessened, as they only serve a higher purpose of obtaining every ending. While the game attempts to question the nature of agency, the game is also complicit in removing agency. Diving further in the question of gamification is the concept of complacency with such systems. The player can restart as many times as they want in the Stanley Parable, and the distinction between player and Stanley is clear, considering that for how meta the game is, the narrator always refers to you as Stanley and not as the player. These elements that uniquely pertain to the medium of video games create a distance between the player and Stanley, which decreases emotional resonance. This sort of gamification can also trivialize the topics the game attempts to dissect. The player may see Stanley's situation as hypothetically harmful, but they still find enjoyment in playing along with the game, whether through defiance or obedience. The player becomes complacent with the established systems within the game that strip away agency, which can affect how they view such systems in real life. In conclusion, applying a Marxist lens to the Stanley Parable's mechanics and narrative unveils how players interact with the idea of agency and labor. The Stanley Parable connects with Marx's ideas of differentiation, commodification of laborers, and abolition of pre-existing systems to demonstrate that agency for Stanley under a capitalist system and the player under the game system can only be achieved through destroying these systems.